Hey everybody, I'm Sam Gross with electricbikereport.com, and with me today is the 2022 Euphree City Robin. Now this is Euphree's second iteration of their electric city bike, and though it doesn't have a full ground up redesign, they've done a number of very small and very smart changes to this bike designed to give Euphree riders exactly what they want. In this video, we're going to dive into the details of what has changed, what's the same, and how this bike performs in the real world, so stick with us. The Euphree City Robin is billed as an electric commuter bike, but it's also built in a way where it could pull double duty as an electric cruiser bike. On one hand, it's got a 500-watt rear hub motor capable of Class 3 speeds and a very stout rear rack that can hold up to 100 pounds of cargo. Both things that are going to be lending themselves to that commuter category. And then on the other hand, it's got a step-through frame, swept handlebars, and a nice comfy seat and an upright geometry that's very comfortable, all things that lend themselves to that electric cruiser bike category. Those are two categories of bikes that I think are very complementary to one another. You can make a cruiser bike be a commuter, and you can make a commuter bike be a cruiser if the company does some smart choices on how they build the bike and spec it out. And I think Euphree has done a really nice job of doing just that with their City Robin. As I mentioned before, the Euphree City Robin is built around a 500-watt rear hub motor that makes 80 Newton meters of torque, and powering that motor is a 864 watt-hour or a 48-volt, 18-amp-hour battery that's integrated into the frame and is also removable. It's also got a 100mm suspension fork in the front and then a SR Suntour NCX suspension seat post in the rear, both of which help take the edge off of any bumps on asphalt and pavement. All of those things are things we saw on the previous 2021 edition of the Euphree City Robin, but some things have changed. Though Euphree didn't do a full ground-up redesign of the City Robin for 2022, they did really listen to what their customers gave them as feedback in the 2021 model. And that some of the changes they made is they gave the bike a 7-speed micro-shift drivetrain. That's the Mezzu model of that drivetrain. And they've also given the bike some Tektro hydraulic disc brakes, the HD E350E brakes, a very reliable name brand brake set we know and like. Among some of the other changes is Euphree has given the bike a knobbier set of Kenda tires that are going to do better on more variable terrain. They've also added water bottle bosses to the frame so you can attach a bottle cage should you want to bring some water along. They've made the lights brighter, they've made the fenders metal, and as I've mentioned before, they've welded that rear rack onto the back of the bike, giving it a really substantial carrying capacity. They've even continued to improve this bike as we've been reviewing it. While we've been in the course of this bike review, Euphree actually sent us a new display. This one used to have a display that was set in the center of the handlebars. They've moved that over to the left-hand side of the bars on a side set display. It's actually very nice. It's a color LCD display. It's got some good functionality to it. And then they've also added a bash guard over the rear derailleur to protect it, one in shipping, and then also while it's just being in use. The derailleur is a very sensitive piece of the bike that we often see bent. So a lot of things that are being improved on this bike, including while we're actually reviewing it. Lastly, and I'll go into more details on this specific change later in this review, but Euphree actually toned down the programming on this bike. Well, so Euphree in their previous edition of the bike actually used to give customers the option between a more mellow programming and a little bit more intense programming that would accelerate quicker from the stop. What they found was that most of their customers wanted that mellower programming that gave the bike a little bit more of a gliding acceleration versus something that was jarring and abrupt. This bike has that mellower programming, and all of the bikes they're shipping from here on out are going to have that as well. We'll dive into more on that a little bit later on how it's affected the performance of the bike, but overall it's really nice, it's really comfortable, and it's very predictable when you're riding. Lastly, One thing to really bear in mind about Euphree that I really want to drive home that's kind of unique about this brand is how closely they've listened to the feedback that their customers have given them. I've worked with a lot of e-bike brands, I've reviewed a lot of different bikes from a lot of different companies, and I've never really seen a company listen so closely to what their customers are asking for. I mean, they didn't do a ground up redesign of this bike, but they changed a lot based on what customers told them, and that's fairly unique. Euphree is a Texas-based company, they're here in the US, they are listening to their customers, they're asking for that feedback. It's really, really cool to see a company do something like that. To get an idea of how the Euphree City Robin's 864 watt-hour frame integrated battery performs, we put it through two separate range tests, the first on PAS2 and the second on PAS5. And what we found was that in that PAS2 test, or a low power range test, the bike went for over 58 miles on a single charge. Bump it up to PAS5, or the highest pedal assist setting, and the bike went for more than 27 miles. Those are both considerable ranges, which is what we should expect out of a very large 864 watt-hour battery. So the message here is that range is not something you're going to have to be concerned about with this bike. It's going to go plenty far, probably further than you're going to want to ride it in a single sitting. So really solid performance out of this 864 watt-hour battery. For the 2022 model, Euphree gave the City Robin a new set of disc brakes. This time they're hydraulic. They're from a brand called Tektro, which if you're not familiar with them, is a very name brand brake company in the affordable e-bike space. We've tested them a million times. We know them, we trust them, and we actually know that you can work on them, which is very, very important. This specific model on this bike are the HD E350 brakes. Again, really solid brake set that we see on a lot of different bikes, but brakes, you can't just trust them based on brand name alone. You have to understand how they work with the rest of the bike. And for that reason, we're going to put it through a brake test. We bring the Euphree City Robin up to 20 miles an hour 5 times, slam on the brakes as hard as possible, and take an average stopping distance. Expect from a brake set like the Tektro HD E350s, the Euphree City Robin performed very, very well in our brake test, coming to a stop on average in 12 feet and 4 inches, which is really, really close to the top 10 of all of the shortest stopping distances we've ever recorded in our brake test of all of the bikes we've ever reviewed. So really, really solid result out of this bike. Just like that big battery and the solid range we got out of it, the braking power on this bike is probably not something you're ever going to really have to worry about. I did all the testing for that. I can attest that it's very, very comfortable while stopping, even when you're having to really slam on the brakes and even get the bike to slide. Everything feels in control. It feels tight and predictable, even under really harsh stopping conditions. So good job from the City Robin. Euphree specs the City Robin with a 500 watt geared rear hub motor from a company called Dafeng. Now this hub motor makes 80 Newton meters of torque, and it's set to a class 3 speed setting, meaning that on pedal assistance it will power you up to 28 miles an hour, and if you're only using the throttle it'll go until 20 miles per hour. That motor power is split into 5 levels of pedal assistance, and to get an idea of how the motor performs in each level of pedal assist, we put it to the test on our circuit track, where we start with the bike with no help from the motor, just pedaling it on our own, and then gently increase the power from 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way up until 5. And what we found was a really, really fast e-bike on flat ground that has a nice division of power among all of its 5 pedal assist levels. It pedals pretty nicely without any help from the motor, which is nice. We kind of expect that from this commuter style e-bike. And all in, it's just fast. Again, 28 miles an hour is a really good clip, and this bike, on flat ground at least, didn't really seem to have any struggle maintaining that speed. Where we did notice a difference on this 2022 model of the bike versus the 2021 edition of the bike was in that new motor programming. Again, it's a little bit mellower, especially at lower speeds. When you're trying to accelerate, it tends to glide up to speed versus really aggressively accelerating up to speed, something which, according to Euphree, a lot of their riders have really liked. It's going to be gentle, predictable, but still really fast. All things that lend itself to a really nice performing e-bike motor. So when it comes to handling, the Euphree City Robin is an incredibly comfortable and predictable e-bike. It's got a step-through frame, which makes it very accessible, and then it uses 100 millimeters of suspension in the front fork, and then 50 millimeters in the back in that form of that SR Suntour XCM suspension seat post. Now, I'm typically a skeptic of suspension seat posts. They don't always work well. Sometimes they're more of like an advertising gimmick than an actual functional piece of the e-bike, but in this case, on a bike that's really going to be predominantly used for cruising and commuting purposes on asphalt, it actually adds quite a bit to it. This is obviously a hardtail. There's no built-in rear suspension in the rear end, so that seat post really takes the edge off of any sort of bumps or square edge like drainage culverts or anything you might encounter on a bike path or the road. It's really nice and keeps your butt planted. Handling wise, the bike is really stable and predictable. It's nice in corners. It's got a good upright riding position that's going to be very comfortable. Again, it kind of lends itself to that cruiser aesthetic that we think this bike could kind of be a crossover in, even though it's billed as a commuter. Overall, I really enjoy it. It's a nice riding e-bike. Again, fun, predictable, stable, all things that lend themselves to a really nice ride. So to get an idea of how the Euphree's 500-watt rear hub motor performs uphill, we're going to put this bike through two separate hill tests. The first, and using just the throttle alone, and the second, we're going to add in the help of my legs on PAS5, the bike's highest pedal assist setting. Now this is going to be an interesting test because we have previously tested the Euphree City Robin and its 500-watt rear hub motor, but we haven't tested it with this new programming that the 2022 model is shipping with. One other note is that this is a 500-watt rear hub motor. It does make a good amount of torque at 80 Newton meters, but we often find that 500-watt rear hub powered bikes tend to struggle specifically in the throttle only portion test of our hill test. So let's see how the Euphree did. Throttle only test of the Euphree City Robin. This is the most recently updated version of the bike in 2022. It's got a 500-watt rear hub motor, which always is interesting in the throttle only portion of the hill. 500 watts seems to be a little bit of a hit or miss wattage on a hill this steep. This thing pitches up above 12% right here, which is pretty obviously giving the City Robin a run for its money. We're dropping speed pretty quick, though it's putting up a good fight. 3 miles an hour is usually when I call it because I start to have to balance the bike instead of it just rolling on its own accord, and we're getting real close to that. We're down to 4.5 and dropping. But we're almost through this steep section, so who knows? Down to 4, 3.9. Oh, we're regaining speed. All right. It made it through that steep, long section of the hill, but we have one more pitch coming up that actually is the one that usually gets the best of these bikes because we have no momentum going into it. Bike's really slowly regaining speed now on this flatter section. It's giving it its best try. We're up to 8, 9, dropping back down. Here's the tough section. Remember, the bike has no momentum going into it. Oh, we're down to 3, 3.2. All right, that's below 3. So this is going to be an incomplete, but I'm going to see if it'll make it through this. Yep, unfortunately, we're going to call that. All right. Cruising on the PAS5, test the City Robin, and even though it didn't make it on throttle power, I have quite a bit of faith it's going to do it with a little help from my legs, and I don't think it's going to take very much. Again, that's pretty common on these 500 watt rear hub bikes. I personally, I'm not an engineer here, but I don't believe, based on some of the results we've seen in our testing with these bikes, that it's a function of power. I think it's more of a function of torque on how much these smaller motors make. Torque is really the important factor when it comes to hill climbing ability. You know, you can have a 750 watt bike that makes just like 50 Newton meters of torque or 60, and that's probably not going to clear this hill. But again, here we go. We're on the section that got the best of the bike in the throttle only test, and it's cruising just fine. So we're definitely going to make it. Not a lot of effort on my part. I'm able to keep talking. There's the end. So obviously the Euphree City Robin did not make it to the top of Hellhole in our throttle only version of the test, but when you added in the help of my legs in PAS5, it did just fine, making it to the top in 1 minute and 22 seconds with an average speed of 13.2 miles an hour, which is a pretty good PAS5 time and average speed. Now, Euphree, interestingly enough, actually predicted this result before we actually put it through the test on Hellhole. They emailed us and said, we don't think it's going to clear Hellhole in the throttle only version of the test with the new programming that they've given this bike, but they did correctly also predict that it was going to do just fine in the PAS5 version of the test. And that's because this new programming has a little bit of a reduced amperage. They have alluded that in the future, they're going to give this bike a controller and a display that will give a rider the ability to increase the amperage just on their own by touching a couple of buttons and changing some settings. That will likely make it clear a hill like Hellhole using just the throttle, but it will also make the bike accelerate a little bit harder and a little bit more of an aggressive power profile. So I really like how this bike climbs. Again, I always say this as almost a disclaimer in our hill test. Hellhole is unique. It's very steep, it's very long. It really is steeper and longer than your average hill that you're gonna find at a bike path or in a city or on just any sort of urban area. It's not something you're gonna encounter all the time. I think this bike did just fine. It didn't take much from my legs to make it clear. Though Euphree is a relatively new e-bike company, they only put out their first bike last year. I'm really impressed with how well they've done with the second iteration of that bike. They didn't need to do a full ground up redesign of the bike. They already had a really good starting point. All they did was they listened to their customers and implemented a bunch of really small things that all added up, really kind of improved the bike's ride quality. I love the fact that it has a welded rear rack now that can accommodate up to 100 pounds of cargo. That's going to be really important for those that want to use this bike as a commuter. And then I also really like that they picked one programming and stuck with it. It simplifies it on their end. It also simplifies it for the consumer, so you don't have to kind of play a guessing game of, do I want a fast bike or do I want a mellower bike? I think a lot of people are gonna really like how this bike accelerates. It's just nice and mellow and predictable. It's chill. It's kind of something that lends itself to the whole cruiser persona of this bike. You can really kind of enjoy the ride without having to feel like you need to really pay attention to what the bike is doing below you. There's just so many things about this bike that seem to be well thought out, and Euphree is doing a really good job of capitalizing on that. And they're just a small company. They listen to their consumers. They want you to really enjoy the bike. That matters to them a lot. And as a reviewer, that matters to me quite a lot. If you've enjoyed this review of the Euphree City Robin, be sure to like and subscribe to the Electric Bike Report channel for more updates on Euphree and the other brands that we cover. Also, if you want to know more about this specific e-bike, be sure to click the link in the description below this video for more detailed written review. For Electric Bike Report, I'm Sam Gross. Thank you so much for watching.